The data crystal arrived on a Tuesday, which was not a concept Thessk had fully internalized until humans explained that they had divided their rotation cycle into 7 named segments, 4 of which they considered more desirable than the others, and this organizational system had no economic function whatsoever. He was still processing that when his communications array flagged the incoming transmission from the New Adelaide Colonial Administration with a priority tag he didn't recognize, social. He set down the margin reports he'd been reviewing. 12 shipping lanes, 43 pending agreements, the usual architecture of a productive morning, and opened the file. An invitation, rendered in warm colors with small illustrated flowers along the border, which was either a decorative tradition or evidence that the colonial printer had a malfunction he should flag to their maintenance division. He read it twice. His abdominal brain, the small and reliable neural cluster nestled behind his ribcage that had never once failed to produce a number, produced a number. The event would consume approximately 6 hours, require a displacement cost of roughly 800 credits in fuel, and yield a projected diplomatic goodwill return of moderate value. Acceptable. He filed the response in the affirmative before he'd finished reading the invitation to its end. He read to its end afterward. The humans were, according to this document, getting merry. Thessk queried the Korvaxi commercial database for context. The entry was brief. Human pair bonding ritual, it said, involves public declarations, exchange of metallic rings, communal food consumption. Economic function, unclear. Risk assessment, low. He read it 3 times and found it answered none of the questions it raised. He queried the secondary academic archive, where the Korvaxi Collective maintained records on galactic species' behavioral patterns as they related to trade vulnerability. He found 4 paragraphs about the ceremony and a footnote that described the resulting legal status as a binding mutual obligation with unlimited liability and no standard termination clause. The footnote had been written by a Korvaxi trade analyst named Vervith, who had apparently attended a human wedding on Proxima Station some 40 years prior. The footnote ended, unusually for a trade report, with the line, "Do not underestimate the ceremony. It means something I cannot explain." Thessk packed a standard diplomatic gift, a data crystal encoded with 3 recently charted trade routes in the outer belt, market value 50,000 credits, the kind of offering appropriate for any diplomatic engagement with significant parties, and boarded his displacement shuttle for New Adelaide. He expected 2 hours, perhaps 3. He expected a contract signing, possibly livestock. He had no idea what was coming for him. New Adelaide was a colony world in its 2nd generation, which meant it had the raw scaffolding of a new settlement overlaid with the accumulated personality of a place that had started to remember itself. The venue was outdoors, which Thessk noted with mild discomfort, open air without the climate predictability of a sealed structure, but the humans had arranged the space with evident intention. Rows of chairs faced a raised platform draped in white cloth and along each side of the central path. Tall arrangements of flowers had been installed in a quantity that defied nutritional justification. Thessk estimated the caloric content of the flowers at 0 and the logistical cost of transporting them at significant, which produced a calculation ratio he found actively unpleasant. He chose a seat in the rear. The other attendees were already present in large numbers, and he observed them with the methodical attention he applied to any negotiating room. Approximately 200 humans, dressed in formal garments, colorful and clearly impractical for labor, which indicated the clothing served a purely symbolic function. Several of the humans near him were already crying. The event had not begun. His biometric fingertips, pressing lightly against the chair's armrest, read the ambient emotional state of the humans within proximity, elevated significantly. Every person within sensor range was already operating at a neurochemical state that, in Thessk's experience, preceded either a very successful deal or a very poor one. There was no middle emotional ground for humans entering high-stakes situations. He noted this. He filed it. He waited. Music began. A stringed instrument, then wind instruments, producing harmonics at a frequency Thessk's auditory processing registered as something between pleasant and structurally unusual, complex enough to engage active listening, simple enough that it didn't require effort. Every human in the venue stood simultaneously without being asked. He stood with them belatedly, following the social cue. Everyone turned toward the back. Danny walked down the aisle in white. The sec observed the processional with his analytical instincts running at full capacity. Female human, early third decade, formal white garment, moving at a deliberately reduced pace alongside an older male, the father. He deduced from the physical similarity and the way the older man kept touching his own face with the back of his hand. The presentation of a trade asset, his abdominal brain suggested helpfully. The formal introduction of a party to a negotiation. The slow pace was probably ceremonial. Then his fingertips caught Marcus. The groom was standing on the platform ahead, a large man with broad hands and a simple suit that had been pressed carefully but still looked slightly wrong on him, in the way clothes looked on humans who wore them rarely. His heart rate was elevated to a level that Thessk associated with humans who had just survived a significant physical threat. His neurochemistry was Thessk processed the readings twice to confirm. Flooded. Dopamine in concentrations he'd read only in humans who had been administered controlled pharmaceutical compounds. Oxytocin at therapeutic levels. Serotonin spiking rhythmically in a pattern that had no analog in his medical reference database because it wasn't a medical state. It was a spontaneous internal event triggered by the proximity of a specific individual. Marcus was looking at Danny, and his body was producing its own euphoria. The sex abdominal brain attempted to calculate the transaction value of this exchange. It ran the variables. 2 parties. Formal presentation. Significant emotional investment. Public venue. 200 witnesses. It searched for the outcome metric. It searched for the deliverable. It looked for the clause that described what Marcus was receiving in exchange for the neurochemical resources he was currently expending. It returned nothing. Not zero. Nothing. An absence where a number should have been. The first wave of nausea arrived. Thessk gripped his chair. He breathed through it the way one breathed through a bad negotiation, steadily, through the nose, maintaining composure. He watched Marcus watch Danny walk toward him. He watched Marcus's face do something that Thessk had no word for in any language he spoke. It opened. That was the only description available. Something opened up behind Marcus's eyes, as if a door had been removed from its frame, and whatever was inside was entirely visible, and Marcus had zero interest in hiding it. A small boy near Thessk leaned over to the woman beside him and whispered that Uncle Marcus was crying already. The woman made a sound between a laugh and something tender and put her arm around the boy. Thesk's hide was beginning to darken along his shoulders. The officiant began to speak, and then Marcus spoke. He stood at the platform with Danny's hands in his, which meant his biometric sensors were reading her directly, though Thessk doubted Marcus knew or cared what his fingertips could detect. What Marcus appeared to care about was the woman in front of him, and the approximately 200 people he'd invited to watch him say what he was about to say, with no apparent concern for dignity or privacy, or the very reasonable alternative of communicating these things in a private document. He said she was the reason he got up in the morning. He said he didn't know what he'd done to deserve her, but whatever it was, he intended to keep doing it. He said he promised to be there, not when it was easy, but when it was hard. When she was sick, when she was angry, when she was wrong and he'd tell her gently, and when she was right and he didn't want to admit it, and he'd admit it anyway because she deserved that. He promised to fix the things that broke and not try to fix the things she only needed to feel. He was crying. He was crying in front of 200 people, and he appeared to have no plans to stop. Thessk's translator was struggling. The word deserve had no Korvaxi equivalent because Korvaxi operating philosophy did not include the concept of earned treatment. You received what you negotiated, nothing more. The word unconditional caused the translator to generate a note. Concept may not translate. No linguistic analog in source language. The word forever was technically translatable but produced an economic absurdity, a commitment extending beyond all reasonable contractual horizons with no renegotiation clause. His abdominal brain was in full revolt. The nausea pressed against his ribs. These were open-ended commitments. No performance benchmarks, no exit terms, no resource exchange, no collateral. If Marcus defaulted on any single promise he'd just made in front of witnesses, there was no legal recourse, no financial penalty, no enforcing authority. The liability was unlimited. The guarantee was nothing. This was the worst contract he had ever witnessed in 40 years of trade negotiations, and he had once sat across a table from a species that tried to purchase an entire star system with a signed promissory note and a medium-sized reptile. Then Danny spoke. She pulled a folded piece of paper from somewhere inside her sleeve, unfolded it with the businesslike manner of someone who had remembered an important document at the last possible moment, and looked at it. Thessk's sensors caught the item's material profile, printed paper, low quality, images of plant specimens on the reverse. A catalog of seeds. She had written her wedding vows on the back of a seed catalog. She said she had spent 30 years being fine on her own, and she was good at it, and she had thought that was enough. Then she met Marcus and realized fine wasn't enough when the alternative was this. She said she chose him not because he was the best option among available options. And here she paused, looked directly at Marcus, and said she had actively tried to find reasons to pick someone else, and she could share those reasons later, but because there were no options. There was only him. There had only ever been him from the moment she understood what she was looking for. She said, "I'm not promising it'll be easy. I'm promising I'll be there, every morning, every fight, every stupid Tuesday, until we're old and you still can't find your keys and I still pretend to be annoyed about it when really I know exactly where they are because I moved them." The room laughed. Simultaneously, a synchronized human response of chest-released vocalization that spiked every emotional reading Thessk's fingertips could reach from his position. Then the room was crying. Also simultaneously, the room was doing both at the same time. His sensors showed it. Laughter and tears running concurrently in the same neurological event. A state that should not be physiologically possible, but which 200 humans were apparently achieving without effort. Thessk's 4 eyes desynchronized. This was a biological stress response he'd experienced perhaps twice in his professional career, during negotiations so complex they'd overloaded his visual processing, each eye beginning to blink independently, his panoramic vision fragmenting as every optical node tried to find a different analytical angle on the situation none of them could parse. He sat very still and let it happen because fighting it would only make it worse. One eye looked at Danny, one looked at Marcus, one looked at the weeping humans on his left, one, without apparent purpose, looked at the sky. His abdominal brain had stopped producing calculations, completely. Not zero, not error, stopped. A state he had not known was possible, like putting your hand where a heartbeat should be and finding silence. It felt like the most profound quiet he had ever experienced inside his own body. He sat in it. He let the ceremony continue around him. The rings came next. His abdominal brain reactivated, briefly and with evident relief, because rings were objects. Objects had mass, composition, market value. He scanned them automatically. Standard alloy construction, minimal precious metal content, workmanship appropriate for a mid-tier colonial production facility. Market value approximately 200 credits per unit. He totaled this, 400 credits, exchanged as the material component of a mutual obligation contract with, as previously established, unlimited liability and no exit clause. His secondary brain produced a single clean assessment. This is the worst trade in the history of commerce. He should have felt vindicated. He felt something else. His fingertips were pressed against his own knee, reading himself, which he rarely did, because Korvaxi weren't built for self-analysis, only external assessment. He was reading his own stress hormones, and they were elevated, but the elevation pattern was wrong for distress. It was a pattern he had no reference category for, something between attention and anticipation, something that wanted to lean forward. The rings went on fingers. The humans near him made sounds. One of the elderly women in the row ahead actually pressed her fist against her mouth as if trying to contain something. Thessk read her from 3 feet away without intending to. Joy so acute it had become physically difficult to hold, as if the body could not be large enough for what she felt. He processed this. He did not have a number for it. He was beginning to understand, very slowly, that he might not get numbers today. The officiant said the words. Marcus kissed Danny. The crowd erupted. Thessk had been in commodities markets during record-breaking sessions. He had been on trading floors during the Yalvath currency collapse. He had stood in hangars when long-range cargo ships made first contact returns. He had never heard anything like 200 humans simultaneously experiencing the same emotion and expressing it through their entire bodies at once. The cheering, the weeping, the percussion of hundreds of pairs of hands struck together in rhythm. His auditory processing registered the peak volume and then just gave up processing it as data and let it be noise. His sensors were screaming, hormonal readings across every human within range, all spiking in the same direction, all synchronized around a single catalytic moment, two people pressing their mouths together while everyone who loved them watched. His species had no equivalent to this. When a Corvaxi finalized a deal, there was a formal acknowledgement, a nod, a document signed, a sensor handshake confirming both parties registered completion. This was not that. This was not quiet or formal or contained. This was a detonation. A synchronized emotional detonation that had been building for an hour and finally had permission to happen, and the humans were letting it happen with everything they had. Thessk sat in his chair, hide dark along his back and shoulders, eyes still desynchronized, blinking in 4 different rhythms, abdominal brain quiet and strange, fingertips throbbing with input volume. He thought, with the very small rational part of his mind still operational, if this is the response to a commitment, what would they do for a threat? He filed that thought away. He would look at it later when he had more capacity for alarm. The celebration moved to a hall nearby, and Thessk found himself carried along by the current of 200 humans who apparently considered his participation obvious and non-negotiable. He was shown to a seat at a long table. Humans sat around him, above him in height, filling the space with a noise level that his translator began simplifying because full capture processing was using too much bandwidth. They talked to him immediately and naturally, and without any apparent awareness that he might need an orientation period. One of them poured something amber-colored into a glass in front of him and said it was whiskey from the Torres family's own still, which was apparently both an honor and a brag. He did not drink it. He watched. The food arrived in quantities that produced in Thessk's trade brain a reflexive calculation of waste. He had been trained since early life that surplus consumption was economically inefficient, that you acquired what you needed and no more, because waste was negative margin. These humans had prepared food for 300 people to feed 200, and everyone seemed to understand this was correct. There was food in the center of the table that existed purely so humans could look at it, serve themselves small portions and then leave most of it. There was a multi-tiered confection at the back of the room that had, to Thessk's knowledge, no function other than to be cut and distributed. It was art made of food. He tried to calculate the labor cost of art made of food versus simply providing food and found that the number refused to be interesting. His abdominal brain was doing something he could only describe as shrugging. All around him, humans ate and touched each other. Hands on shoulders, arms around waists. 2 old men at the far end of the table were leaning together and laughing at something on a small screen, their heads nearly touching. The physical contact density was extraordinary. By Corvaxi standards, this level of voluntary physical proximity to non-bonded individuals indicated either a medical emergency requiring mutual support or a significant lapse in professional conduct. His fingertips kept catching stray readings from accidental contact, small fragments of emotional data flooding in from every brush of an elbow or tap on his arm, and the volume was making them ache. He was trying to organize all of this into a legible framework when a human stood at the front of the hall and asked for attention. This was the best man, Carlos, Marcus's brother, identified by the way Marcus looked at him, that same open-door expression, but layered over something older and more complicated. Thessk watched Carlos's face while the room settled and noticed something. The man was braced, not afraid but prepared, the way you prepared before saying something true. Carlos told stories about Marcus as a child, embarrassing ones. He described in detail that produced sustained laughter from the room, a childhood incident involving a column vehicle, a drainage ditch, and a series of progressively worse decisions made over the course of 4 hours. He described Marcus at 14 attempting to impress a classmate with a feat of strength that ended in structural damage to their family's hydroponic bay. He was funny. He was skilled at being funny in a way that Thessk, who rarely paid attention to humor as a phenomenon, found himself following closely despite not understanding many of the references. Then Carlos stopped being funny. He said, when Marcus was 16, their mother died. Thessk's sensors caught the room's response, a settling, like a pressure change, a collective breath drawn and held. Carlos said their mother had been the kind of person who turned up for things, who showed up when it was inconvenient, who called back within the hour, who drove 2 hours through a storm because her son needed her. He said Marcus had inherited that from her, not from her death, but from her life. He said that losing her could have made Marcus into someone who didn't commit to things, someone who kept distance as protection. He said Marcus had specifically refused to become that person, that he had taken his grief and done something with it that their mother would have recognized. His voice broke, clearly, cleanly, in the way voices broke when they reached the part that was actually true. He said their mother would have loved Danny, would have loved her for the way she made Marcus laugh, for the way she argued with him without cruelty, for the way she made him a better version of what he already was. And then he said, to Marcus and Danny, Mom would have said you found the right one, bro, and she would have been right. He raised his glass. 200 humans raised their glasses. Thessk's fingertips detonated. He had read synchronized emotional responses twice before in his career, and both times they had involved the conclusion of major multi-party negotiations, the physical release of prolonged tension. What he read now was not tension released, but grief held together with love, and offered publicly by a man who had chosen to be vulnerable in front of everyone who cared about him, and every human in the room had received it and responded to it with the same feeling, at the same moment, a wave that traveled the hall in the time it took to raise a glass. His abdominal brain, which had been quiet since the ceremony, produced something, not a number. He was certain it was not a number. It was more like a direction, a pointing. His secondary brain, which had spent 4 decades calculating the value of everything, pointed at the room full of grieving, celebrating, laughing, weeping humans and produced something that registered as, this is worth more than anything in my database. He had never had a non-numerical output from that organ before. He sat with it. He did not know what to do with it. He noticed distantly that the nausea was gone. His hide was still dark. His eyes had stopped desynchronizing. They were running at different rates, yes, but slower now, almost as if resting. His fingertips still ached from the input volume. But the nausea had been replaced by something warm that sat in his chest and didn't feel like a trade. Didn't feel like anything he had a name for. He was still examining this when the music changed, and the floor was cleared and the humans began to dance. He watched this for some time. His translator informed him that dancing was ritual synchronized movement performed to music, typically with a partner, typically at celebrations, economic function unknown. He watched Marcus and Danny move together, badly, both of them, laughing with a clear awareness that they were not skilled at this and had decided that was fine. He watched old couples who moved in the practiced synchronization of people who had made this motion together so many times the pattern had become physical memory. He watched parents holding children, spinning them until the children shrieked. He watched a young couple who couldn't stop laughing at themselves long enough to complete a full rotation. He calculated the economic function of this. It was not possible. There was no economic function. It was movement performed because movement felt good and music was playing, and the people you loved were nearby. It was effort expended with no output other than the experience of expending it together. He was drafting a note on this for the academic archive when something seized his 3-fingered hand. Grandmother Io was small. He knew this in the abstract. He had seen her cross the hall, observed her movement through the space with the authority of someone who had not accepted the concept of an obstacle in several decades. He had not known she was approaching him until her hand was in his, because she had apparently moved with the directness of someone who did not announce her arrivals. She was looking up at him. Her face had deep lines in it, the kind that came from years of specific expressions, and the expression currently occupying it was the one Thessk associated with counterparties who had already decided how the negotiation was going to end. "You are dancing," she said. He told her he didn't know how. She said, "Neither does anyone else." She pulled him onto the floor. Thessk weighed substantially more than Grandmother Io. He was broader, denser, built along the stocky, load-bearing lines that made Korvoxy formidable at endurance rather than speed. None of this mattered. She had his hand in a forward momentum that brooked no biological arguments, and he found himself on the dance floor with the rest of the humans before he had completed the sentence about not knowing how. He was very wrong for this. His feet were the wrong shape, placed on the wrong joints for the lateral weight. Transfer the music seemed to be requesting. He moved with the particular awkwardness of a large body attempting a motion it had never rehearsed, and he was aware that several of the humans nearby were watching him with expressions that ranged from amused to delighted. Grandmother Io adjusted his hand position. She guided his steps. She laughed at his feet, a full, bright laugh with nothing unkind in it, and said, in a tone he associated with people who found life consistently funnier than it needed to be, "You need to trust your feet a little more. Stop telling them where to go." His biometric fingertips were pressed against her hand. He was reading her. Pure joy, uncomplicated, agenda-free, return to baseline joy, the kind he had read exactly once before in his career, from a human child watching a cargo drone perform an unscheduled aerial maneuver. No transaction, no social calculation, no expectation of anything in return from him or the music or the evening. She was happy because she was here, and her granddaughter had just married a man who looked at her the way Marcus looked at Danny, and the music was playing, and she had decided this strange gray-brown alien was going to dance. He had never read this from any party in any negotiation, because this wasn't a negotiation. It had never been a negotiation. None of today had been a negotiation, and he was only now fully processing what that meant. His four eyes found synchronization. All four, looking at the same place, the same room. For the first time since Danny had walked down the aisle, his visual processing unified, and he saw what was in front of him as a single image rather than four competing analyses. A hall full of humans choosing to be happy together. He was aware, in the detached way you became aware of your own physiology during unusual events, that his hide was lightening. The capillaries that had been constricting for hours were releasing. The darkening he'd carried since the ceremony, a response so automatic he hadn't tracked its onset, was lifting. He didn't try to stop it. He let it lift. He moved through 2 dances, badly, while Grandmother Io laughed at him with the affection of someone who genuinely did not care whether he got it right. She patted his arm at the end and said, "Better, not good, but better." He did not tell her that better was, in the context of where he'd started, a more generous assessment than the facts supported. He had the sense she knew this and had said it anyway. A gift without transaction. A second one, from a human he had met 40 minutes ago. Near the end of the evening, Danny stood with her back to the gathered unmarried humans and threw the flowers over her shoulder. A small chaos erupted, bodies jumping, hands reaching, a brief contested scramble that produced a winner who screamed in triumph with the intensity of someone who had just closed a major deal. Thessk asked the human beside him what the winner received. Supposedly the next to get married, the human said. He asked what the tangible benefit of that was. The human laughed. There isn't one. It's just fun. He sat with this, fun, an experience without output, an activity whose entire value was the experience of doing it. His abdominal brain made an attempt to assign this a number, ran the variables, found no appropriate unit of measurement, and then, for the second time that day, returned something that wasn't a number. It just registered as good. Simply, flatly, without elaboration, good. He was not nauseous. His hide was the lightest it had been in years. The evening wound down the way good things wound down, gradually, with everyone pretending they weren't winding down, extending small moments for as long as they could hold them. The lights softened, voices grew quieter. Goodbyes were said slowly, with extra touches, with a particular human reluctance to let a thing finish when the thing had been good. Thessk stood outside in the cool New Adelaide night. The stars were different here than from the trade lanes, brighter at this distance from the core, less obscured by industrial drift. He was looking at them when he heard footsteps behind him and turned to find Marcus. The groom had loosened the collar of his suit, and his eyes were still red from crying, which he had apparently been doing on and off since before the ceremony and had continued through the dancing and the speeches. He looked entirely unbothered by this. He extended his hand. Thessk took it, and his fingertips read Marcus one final time. Contentment, not relief, contentment. Not the end of tension, but the absence of tension from something that had never been tense. A man who had made a choice and was completely certain of it, not because certainty was guaranteed, but because he had decided to stop needing a guarantee. The anxiety Thessk would have expected from anyone who had just signed an unlimited liability contract with no exit clause simply wasn't there. There was just a large human with red eyes and a loosened collar who was happy in the deep and unspectacular way of someone who was exactly where they intended to be. Marcus thanked him for coming. Thessk told him, his translator working through the approximations, that among the Korvaxi, pair bonding was a process, genetic compatibility assessments, resource audits, projected offspring viability scores. A formal contract negotiated between family units with the goal of minimizing risk and maximizing projected return on biological and economic investment. That the Korvaxi model had been refined over millennia and produced stable pair bonds with measurable outcomes. Marcus listened to all of this. Thessk said what he had witnessed today involved none of those things. Zero risk assessment, zero resource calculation, a contract with no exit clause and no enforcement mechanism and no performance metrics of any kind. By any Korvaxi model of rational decision-making, everything Marcus had done today was an error. Marcus grinned. "Yeah," he said, "that's about right." Thessk asked him, with the genuine uncertainty of someone who had spent the day having his fundamental frameworks dismantled piece by piece. Why? Why commit everything, completely, publicly, permanently, to one individual with no guarantee of return? Marcus turned and looked back through the venue doors. Inside, Danny was laughing with her grandmother, the sound carrying through the warm air between them. Grandmother Io was doing something with her hands that seemed to be an impression of Thessk dancing, and Danny was doubled over. The old woman caught Thesk's eye through the doorway, pointed at him, and laughed harder. Marcus watched his wife laugh. He said, "Because she's my person. That's not a calculation, it's just true." Thessk returned to his shuttle. He sat in the small galley while the craft cleared atmosphere and the lights of New Adelaide fell away below him. His quarters were quiet, which was the way he preferred them. Usually the quiet felt like the right setting for productivity. Tonight it felt like something else, like the silence after music stops, the kind you sit in for a moment before you go back to ordinary things. The diplomatic gift sat on his desk. The data crystal. 50,000 credits of charted trade routes, appropriate for a major diplomatic engagement. He had carried it all day without giving it. He looked at it now and understood why. It was the wrong kind of value. He had been there long enough to know the difference. He opened his diplomatic log to file the post-event report. Standard procedure. Event type, parties present, outcomes, cultural notes. He sat with the cursor blinking and thought about what category applied. Not a trade, not a negotiation, not a contract signing despite the presence of contractual elements, not a diplomatic engagement in the technical sense, though he had been technically representing the Korvaxi Mercantile Union. The Korvaxi had a category for almost everything. He could not find the right category. He began to write. Attended human pair bonding ceremony on New Adelaide, he wrote. Total duration, 7 hours. Attended as diplomatic observer representing the Korvaxi Mercantile Union. Economic analysis, impossible. He paused. He kept writing. The participants exchanged rings with a combined market value of approximately 400 credits and made promises with no market value and unlimited liability. By every metric the Korvaxi trade model provides, this event was economically irrational. The humans present knew this and did not care. I do not believe I can call that a failure of analysis on their part. He paused again. He looked at the stars outside the viewport. The best man gave a speech about grief and love that produced a synchronized neurological event in 200 humans simultaneously. A woman who weighs a third of what I do made me dance. I was read repeatedly, emotional data I have no category for. My abdominal brain, which has processed 10,000 commercial transactions without producing a non-numerical result, today produced 2 outputs that were not numbers. When asked to evaluate the act of promising everything to one person with no guarantee of return, it did not calculate a loss. It produced a direction. It pointed, and what it pointed at was the room. He stopped writing. He read what he had written. He added one more line. I believe the Corvaxi model assumes that rational actors seek to minimize loss and maximize return. I believe humans do not consider love an economic act. They consider it the opposite of an economic act, a thing done precisely because it cannot be calculated, because the point of it is that you do it anyway. There is no Corvaxi model for a transaction where the value is infinite and the price is a choice. I spent today watching 200 people celebrate two of their own for making that choice in public and meaning it completely. I spent today learning that my secondary brain, the organ that processes value, had been missing an entire category of worth that doesn't come in numbers. He closed the log. He sat back. His four eyes were blinking in synchronization, slowly, comfortably. His hide was pale, the lightest it ever got, the color of someone at rest. His fingertips were still, his abdominal brain was quiet, and the silence inside him had the quality of something that had arrived rather than something that was missing. He had left New Adelaide without filing the event into a category. He had written in a trade report that would eventually be reviewed by junior analysts who would be very confused by it. The humans call it love. My abdominal brain, the organ that has never once returned an answer it couldn't quantify, tried to calculate its worth and, for the first time in my life, came back with something I can only describe as enough. He looked at the stars. He thought about Marcus's face when Danny walked down the aisle. He thought about Danny writing her vows on the back of a seed catalog. He thought about Carlos's voice breaking and not trying to fix it. He thought about Grandmother Io's hand in his, dragging him onto a dance floor, laughing at his feet, reading as pure joy. He thought about a concept his language had no word for, a thing done not because it was profitable or rational or efficient, but because it was true, a thing offered without guarantee, received without contract, and held, without a clause in the universe requiring anyone to hold it, by choice. He thought, I have assessed 10,000 deals. I have sat across tables from species that traded in antimatter and futures in stellar evolution and the memory archives of dead civilizations. I have never been moved by any of it. I was moved today by a mechanic and a hydroponics engineer who promised each other stupid Tuesdays in front of everyone they loved. He thought, I don't have a number for that, he thought. I don't think it needs one. He closed his eyes, all four of them together. He let himself be enough.